In this video, we're going to talk about NPM, the JavaScript package manager. We're going to talk about what a package is, and we're going to specifically dive into bringing in React Router, which is one of these packages that's hosted on NPM, into our project. So React Router is a library that allows us to make components that are sensitive to the URL bar. So essentially navigational components. So we're going to be able to create separate pages within our application, and we'll be able to load different components on those pages. It's going to be similar to how we split our application into about.html and index.html when we were working in vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's come back to NPM. And so NPM is the JavaScript package manager. It is both a command line tool and a package registry. So let's talk about that package registry aspect first. So package registry just means it's a centralized collection of libraries, and libraries are just chunks of code that are written by other developers to do something. So if we check out some of the popular ones over here, like Chalk is a library that is for outputting colored text in a command line window. So we're not going to use this inside of our front-end projects, but in our server-side projects, we might bring in this library. And this one in particular, you can see the folks who are collaborators on this repository. You can go for this project to the GitHub page, which has all of the source code for the library. You can look at the history of the library. So each library that's in the NPM's registry is going to be uploaded by a developer or a set of developers and maintained by a developer or a set of developers. And so what the library does, that is up to whoever uploaded it. And how well documented that is, this README that we're going through, is also going to be determined by that developer. So here we have a pretty good README, which tells us how to install this using the NPM command line tool, and then gives us some code snippets of how to actually use it in a project. And we can explore, there are plenty of other packages in NPM. So like D3 is a package for doing data visualization. P5 is a creative coding library for JavaScript. We can also see some of the packages that we're already using, like React is in here and React DOM. If we click on them, we can see some information like how many people have downloaded it, what version, where the source code is, the last publish, etc. So that is the package registry part of what NPM is, but NPM is also a command line tool. So if you go to the documentation page, there is information at a high level about NPM and packages and modules, and there's also documentation for the CLI, or the command line interface. So this lists out all of the different commands that come along with NPM when you install it. And so for instance, we are going to use this install command to install packages, and we are also going to use the uninstall command to remove packages. And we've already used a couple. So we used npx, which is bundled with npm, which allows you to install and run a package in one line of code. And then we've also used npm run start, or npm start, to actually run our create React app application. So if you're working with NPM and you want to dig deeper, the documentation page is a great resource. And we're going to talk about package.json. And so this is a useful page in the documentation that explains what all of the keys and values in our package.json file mean and what they're used for. So let's actually pull up the project that we have and look at package.json. So this is that file that is being described in the browser. So for instance, it has this name field, and if I flip back to the browser, I can see here is the description of what the name is. That it's the most important thing in your package, that it has some rules, like it must be less than 214 characters, etc. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these properties, but if you want to learn more about them, you can look at that documentation page. This whole file is a JSON file, so .json at the end here, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So it's essentially a JavaScript object literal in here with a few restrictions, like all of the property names must be in quotations, and there's some restrictions on what values are possible to put into this JSON format. So for instance, we can't put functions in here. We're stuck with just primitives, so we can have numbers and strings and Boolean values and arrays and objects. So when we used create React app, it set us up with this package .json that is configured for this create React app project. It has the name, which it got from the folder that we installed our create React app application into. It has a version number, which we're not really going to use. And then it has this dependency list. So this is telling our project which versions of different packages from NPM we need in our project. So for instance, it's saying here we need React, and we need React version 16.13.1 or higher, and we need React DOM 16.13.1 or higher. When we install dependencies using the command line tool, it's actually going to go into this JSON file and add a new object or a new entry into this dependencies object in our JSON file. Because we have a build pipeline set up here that comes from Create React App, which uses a piece of software called Webpack, anything that we install as a dependency, we are able to use in our project. So we were able to say in index, import React DOM and import React because they had been installed and registered in this package.json file. In this file, we've also got a scripts section, which is a object that describes the commands that we can execute using npm run. So we've got npm run start, which runs React script start. We've also got a build command that will take our code and output the built version that we could upload to a server. We've got a test command, and we've got an eject command. We can install our own commands here as well by just adding more entries, and we can name them whatever we want. So if we had like a command that we wanted to run when we were building like a mobile version of our application, we could have like mobile build and then specify what command should run when mobile build is run. So this project comes with some things from Create React App. It's essentially this React scripts that helps build and run the application, and that's one of the dependencies that's registered up here. I think that's all that I want to talk about for this package.json. There are a few extra things here that are not in the standard package.json documentation, like browser list and ESLint config, but come from packages that are installed and used inside of React scripts. As a side note, there's also a yarn.lock file here and a package-lock.json file. So npm is one command line tool for interfacing with the npm registry and installing and uninstalling dependencies and running scripts. Yarn is another one, and Create React App comes set up with Yarn. So this is just another command line tool that allows you to interface with package registry. In this class, we're just using npm, so we don't really have to worry too much about Yarn and Yarn lock. Package-lock is a thing that is built based on the package.json file. So when we install these dependencies, package.lock spiders through all of them and says, here are the specific versions of all the dependencies, and the dependencies and the dependencies, and the versions that all of those use, so that you can have a deterministic environment. So you can set it up on one computer and then be able to pull all of the same packages on another computer without having like breaking changes because one computer had a slightly different version of a dependency installed. Okay, that is enough at a high level. What I want to do is show you how to install a dependency and run a dependency. So I think what we're going to install is a dependency. Let's look at Tone.js. So this is a library that uses the web API, the web audio APIs to allow you to create things like a synthesizer and play notes through that synthesizer. And there are a lot of great examples on Tone.js's homepage, like an instrument that you can build with Tone.js. So we're just going to use this as a quick introduction to how to install a package and use a package, and we will work our way up to React Router and bringing React Router in. So Tone.js, if I look at the README, and this is the process you're going to have to go through for every package that you want to install, is like, how do I install it? There's usually going to be some installation instructions, and then how do I use it in my project? So here it is telling me to run npm install tone. So if I flip back to my React project, I open up a terminal window, and when you're installing new packages or uninstalling packages, it's usually a good idea to kill the server and the command that is building your project progressively every time you change the file. So if I had npm run start running, what I could do is just hit Control-C in here to kill this, or hit the little trash icon to kill the terminal. So here I just hit Control-C, killed it, and then I can run npm install tone. And as this installs, it is putting this dependency into my node modules folder inside of the project. And if I keep this package.json open, we should see tone get added here at the end. So here it has installed tone and said that this project needs 14.7.39 or higher. So packages are installed to this node modules folder. So if I reveal an explorer and go in here, I can scroll down to T and find tone. And so here's all the source code that was installed with tone. I could also look in here in the R for React. So we've got React DOM, we've got React, we've got a couple of other things like React scripts. And you may be wondering why there's so many things in node modules, even though in our dependencies, we only have 7 things. And that's because each dependency that you have can have dependencies, and those dependencies can have dependencies, and so on. So these are all of the packages that were brought in to run these 7 packages. And you can think of the node modules folder as a temporary folder. When we deploy our code to a server, we don't want to send this folder there. When we share our project with other developers, we don't want to share this folder because this is 166 megabytes of data that doesn't need to be transferred. So if you delete your node modules folder, or you pull down a new project that doesn't have the node modules folder already, all you have to do is run npm install or npm I. And so when we did npm install tone, that brought in that specific library, but npm install without any package name is going to run through all of your dependencies and install them for the project. All right, so now that we've got Tone.js installed, we can actually use it in our project. So these dependencies, because this application is being built through React scripts with a piece of software called Webpack, all of these dependencies are available to us to import from our project. So let's just run through getting the basic synthesizer working with tone in our index.js. So if I flip back here and let's look at this sample here for creating a synthesizer. So we have to import tone and then create a synthesizer and tell it to trigger a middle C for 1/8 of a note. So I'm going to copy this code, bring it over into my project here. I'm going to import tone, And we're going to have to do something a little bit different here because Tone doesn't use default export. So I can say import star as Tone, which means grab everything from the Tone library and import it under the name Tone. And then down here, what I can do is run this code that uses the Tone library. So one thing we're going to see if we try and run this, and this is just a quirk of the web audio APIs, is that let's get a server up and running here, npm run start, is that this stuff that uses the web API isn't allowed to be triggered until the user has interacted with the page. And that's so that you don't end up getting web pages that spam the user with a bunch of sounds, even though they haven't interacted, like if it's a pop-up. So here, even if I try and run this, I'm going to get a warning that we're not allowed to use this audio context until the user has initiated a gesture. So one way that we can just simply wrap this up is to do document.body add event listener and add a click handler here. So this code will now only run when I click on the document.body, which should, let me make sure my audio is up. Okay, so now when I click, it should play a sound. And it only works if I click on the body. So remember, our body is this element here. So if I click outside of it, it's not going to work. So let's flip back to the example here, and we can see that there's a way to schedule a bunch of sounds. So if you use tone.now, you're able to say, okay, start with a middle C, and then wait some amount of time, so wait one beat, and then release the C, or you can schedule a series of notes to be played. So I'm just going to do something like that as a quick demo. So I wrote this so that we don't have to watch me type it out. So this plays a middle C, and then D, E, F, all the way through the major scale, and it does it for a fourth note starting now, and then an 8 count. So they're gonna play in sequence. So if I save this, check it out in the browser. So it plays through the major scale. So that's a really simple demo of how to use a dependency. Each dependency is going to involve a slightly different process, but it's going to look like this, where we import a library and then we're able to use that library. And then the specifics of how you use it, you're going to have to read the documentation. So you're going to have to work on that skill of reading technical documentation and understanding how to implement code from that technical documentation. So maybe just to wrap this up, let's put this into a React component. And let's say this is our major or our musical button. I'm going to import React, export a musical, create a musical button, export that musical button as the default. And this is just going to return a button, so an HTML element. We're going to use a prop that we haven't seen before, I don't think, which, props is the children prop. So when we use this component somewhere else, like we render out musical button and we put something in here, like play major scale, this is going to be passed in as the children. And so you can actually pass in markup here. So instead of it just being text in here, I could make something bold, or wrap something in a span, or have a series of nested elements. So I'm going to put the children inside of this button, and then let's have a play music. And we're going to say when the button is clicked, on click equals play music. And then we can go back to index and move this over. So I want to import tone at the top, and I want to use this code in here inside of play music to create the new synthesizer and have it play. We can get rid of this. And then I'm going to go back to my app, and instead of returning new game form, I am going to return the musical button here. And oops, I need to put some text in here to say like play major scale. Save it, check it out in the browser. So now that text that I passed in is showing up inside of the button, and when I click, it plays through the scale. So I'm going to just kill that by refreshing the page. So whatever we pass in here ends up in our musical button as this children prop. It is a special prop inside of React for you to be able to pass in whatever the contents of a component should be. And we've just hooked this up to use Tone.js. Let's look at one more dependency together before we get to React Router. So the one that I want to show you is called React Confetti. So if I search for React Confetti here on the Npm registry, this is specifically a library that wraps up a React component. So there are other libraries like that, like Material UI, which we glanced at earlier, which wraps up a bunch of React components. But this one in particular, we can import, we can get some confetti flying around our page, and then it documents the properties, the props that our confetti takes. So we can specify where it is on the page. We can specify its width and height, how many pieces, wind, gravity, velocity, colors, etc. So we're going to go through the same process. I want to run this npm install React Confetti. So I'm going to kill the server, run npm install React Confetti, and watch as that shows up here in a moment. There we go. So it finished installing. It showed up in package. I can start my server again. And I want to create a demo confetti React component. So importing React, from React, creating that function, demo confetti, and exporting that function, demo confetti. And then this is going to return. Let's just put a div in here. If I go back to my app, instead of using the musical button, I can bring in that confetti demo. I'm going to clean up my imports, remove some of the ones we're no longer using, and make sure that I've got my import for my demo confetti. So we can see the word confetti showing up on our page. So we have our component set up and the dependency installed, and then it's just a matter of using it and referring back to the documentation. So when we import React Confetti, we are getting a confetti component that then we can configure with width, height, wind, gravity using this table. So what I'm going to do is go to my demo confetti, import confetti from React Confetti. And in this div, let's wrap this in an h1. And then drop our, confetti in here. So let's look at the documentation again. So we can see here that it is telling us that we should probably specify a width and height as properties. By default, it's going to read window.innerWidth and window.innerHeight, which are properties that you have access to in JavaScript, which give you the size of the window. So what it's saying is that, this is not going to responsively check the width and height. So if your browser resizes after you load the confetti, the confetti is not necessarily going to match that new width and height unless you tell it to. I'm not going to bother with this because this is an extra dependency and we're just doing a simple demo. So we'll see what we get without specifying any properties, and then we can change some of the properties and see what happens. So I'm going to make sure that I've got my component saved, and I flip back to the browser here, and we can see confetti dropping. So let's try changing some of those props. So if we scroll down and look through this, we can see there's a gravity and a wind and a friction. So maybe we'll try adding some wind. Let's see what happens. This is a number if we specify like a wind of 1. So wind equals 1. Ooh, that's really strong. So we could turn that down. We could try like a wind of 0.1. And we've got gravity, which it says defaults to 0.1. So we could try turning that up. Gravity of 2. Things are going to accelerate down quite quickly with that heavy gravity. Let's integrate some state in here too. So let's have this gravity turn on and off based on a button click. So if we scroll around here, we can see that there's a run property, which is a Boolean of true or false, which we can say whether or not the confetti should run. So if I pass in run equals true here, or let's do false since it runs by default. We can see the confetti is not showing up. So what we want to do is have some state. So is running, set is running. Let's have it start as false. We will pass that in here, and we'll create a button that allows us to turn that confetti on and off. So button toggle confetti, and we'll create a toggle confetti function. Whoops. There's an arrow function here that just does set is running, and what we're going to do is pass in not is running. So this is going to take whatever the value of is running is. So if it's true and we say not at the front, we're going to get false. If this is false, we're going to get true. So it's going to give us the opposite, which allows us to toggle from true to false or false to true. Let's hook this up to our on click. Toggle confetti. So now we should be able to toggle it on and off and on and off. And if we wanted to, we could make this text respond to whether or not it's running. So we could say the button text, or let's make this let. If is running, then the button text will be turn confetti off. Otherwise, turn confetti on. So turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off. And there's a shorter way to do this using something called a ternary operator, ternary conditional operator in JavaScript, which if we did it that way would look something like this. Button text, whoops, equals turn confetti This does the same thing. Conditional ternary operator is an operator that takes 3 parameters in this structure, where you specify a condition. If the condition's true, this is what you get back. If the condition is false, this is what you get back. So it's really just a compressed version of an if statement. This does the same thing. So we'll see this ternary conditional operator pop up a fair bit as we dive deeper into React. But that's all that is involved in bringing in these dependencies. It's installing them, then making sure we read through the documentation carefully and trying out implementing it. Now we are going to turn our attention to React Router. So React Router you can find from the registry, React Router, or you can find by Googling it. documentation here is going to be pretty short, but then if you go to their homepage, so if you Google it, React Router, you get a much more full experience of reading the documentation. So this is the recommended way to go through learning about React Router. And when you are on their main page for React Router, there's the web and native version. Native would be, if you're using React Native, we are using React DOM, so we're using the web version. So this is the documentation that we want to read. It is going to tell us some similar installation instructions. So Npm Install, React Router DOM, that's the library we want. And then a slim example of how to do routing. So if we look at this example, it's telling us we're going to need to import a few things. So we're going to have to import switch, route, link, and browser router. What we're going to do is wrap our whole application in that router, that browser router. We are going to have a switch with routes inside of it. And what's going to happen is that when the URL in our URL bar matches /about, this is the component that will display. And if that URL matches /users, this will be the component that displays. If it matches just /, it'll display this home component. I should note that there is a way to use React Router where these URLs don't show up in the URL bar, they show up in memory. So just know that that's a possibility out there. We're going to use it where these actually show up in the URL bar. And if we break down some of these components to try and figure out how they're working, we have a switch which wraps all these routes, and it's telling us here that the switch looks through all the root children that it has and renders the first one that matches. So this structure allows us to ensure that only one of these components will show up on the page. You can think of it as like a switch statement, which we saw in vanilla JavaScript. And our routes are the components that we use to configure these kind of matching to go from the URL to a component. And then the link component that we saw here is used in place of hyperlinks in our application. So we're not going to directly use the anchor tag, but we're going to use React Router's link component, which prevents the anchor. If we had used a regular anchor tag, a regular hyperlink, it prevents it from loading the new page and instead tells React Router to go ahead and re-render. And that triggers this router to re-render and triggers with the new path the right component to load. So if you click on /about, this will re-render and it will come down here and match the about component. So let's bring this into our code and start working with it. We're going to install React Router DOM. So I'm going to kill this with Control C. Looks like my terminal is frozen, so I'm just going to kill manually over here. Pop open a new one. Npm I is short for Npm Install, so I'm going to use the short version, React Router DOM. And we need to match exactly the name of the package from the registry or from the installation instructions here. Okay, so it finished installing, so I should see it in my package now. We've got React Router DOM 5.20 or greater. And I'm going to restart the application, npm run start, and go to my app. So here we're going to do some basic routing, and then we'll kind of start stubbing out, creating placeholders for the pages in our application. So let's make sure that this opened in our browser again. We got it. I'm going to get rid of this demo confetti, and I want to import those things that we saw we need to import from React Router DOM. And so I'm doing the import with the placeholder here so that I get the autocompletes, the IntelliSense as I'm typing. So I want link, and I want browser router, and I want switch, and I want route. This structure that we're seeing here, these are named exports, which we've been dealing with default exports where when you import them, you can rename them whatever you want. With named exports, we have to use this curly bracket, this object destructuring syntax, and use the exact name that comes from the package. So here I'm going to render things out using my browser router. And then into the browser router, I will put a switch statement. And inside of that switch, we will have routes. And let's just print out a paragraph here, or we'll put it in an H1. Page 1. And the path for this will be equal to /page1. And copy this, page 2. And page 3. So if I save this and run this in the browser, we should see only one of these routes rendering. So depending on what I put in the URL bar, if I put /page1, this is what should render. And because it's wrapped in a switch, it's the only thing that will render. If we go to page 2, we should see this one. Page 3, we should see this one. So if I save it, there's nothing on the home page, but if I go to page 1, there we go. If I go to page 2, page 3. So that's the structure of our switch and routes. And the structure for our application is going to be something more like we're going to match the home page, and this will be our like new game form. We're going to have a play route, which is starting the game, and then we'll have our about page. And the way that this switch works, remember, it's going to match from the top to the bottom. So if I put this path matching here for / at the top, doesn't matter what URL I put in. So if I go to play or I go to about, this is going to catch it because all of the paths are going to start with a /. So if I go back to the browser and I try and go to /play, I'm still going to get new game form because this URL started with a /. So there are two ways to fix that. Because the switch is like a switch statement where the first matching case will be what renders, we could just move this to the bottom. So if play matches, this gets rendered. If about matches, this gets rendered. And then anything else is kind of going to get caught by this. The alternative is that you can also specify an exact prop here. And if I go back to the documentation for React Router, and I go to scroll down to route, it has listed all of the props that I can pass in. So I can specify exact, which if we pass that in, we can see that that will only match when the path that you're on exactly matches. So if we use exact, then only /. So it can't be /play, it would have to just be /. So I'm going to leave this as matching the initial documentation where we just make sure that we list these in the right order. So play, then about, then /. And now it should work where I can go to / for the new game form, play to start the game, about to see about me. And we can see a demo of how link works in here too. So I'm going to drop the link, and this has to be inside of our browser router. It has to be a child. So let's create a really simple nav, and let's list the routes using the link element and the path. Well, actually, let's pull up the documentation for link so that we can practice our process of reading documentation. If I scroll around the sidebar here down to or up to link, we can see that there are a couple of different properties we can specify, and there are a couple ways for us to pass the location the link should point to. So 2 is the name of the prop. It accepts a string, but it also accepts an object or a function. We're just going to use the string version. So I'm going to say that this link should go to homepage. And let's copy this. Whoops. Let's copy this 3 times and get some spaces here. This will go to our play, and it will say play, and this will go to our about, and it will say about. So if I save this, now we should have links that show up on our page at the top, and if I click on them, they will update the component. And what's cool about this and using React is that this isn't actually reloading the page. So we're not going to, it's not as if the page has like a little flicker because we've gone from one HTML file to the next. We are still within the same application. It is just dynamically changing the contents that are inside of our switch. You'll notice here that React, or really Prettier, is doing something a little bit funky here when it wrapped the new lines. So it is inserting a space character using our JavaScript escape syntax. That is something that may happen as you're writing components. That's perfectly fine and valid. So don't freak out if you see that get inserted into your code. Let's take a second to just familiarize ourselves a little bit more with the documentation page for React Router, and then we'll come back and start building out placeholders for these pages. And we'll start using that empty folder of pages that we created a while back. So as I scroll around, on the left-hand side, there are a bunch of examples. So there is a basic example of routing. This is essentially what we just did, where we had a nav that had some links and we had a switch with some routes. There's an example with how you can pass parameters. So here is a syntax for how you can express that this dynamically matches URLs that have an ID variable in them. And then that variable is available to the child elements using a hook, the useParams hook. So when we go to the Netflix page, it is able to pull Netflix from the URL and use it here, which can be really helpful if you're building dynamic applications, like you're building a shopping application where there's a whole bunch of resources. You have a whole bunch of different items that are in the shop, and you want to have a page that matches any of those items and displays some basic information like the name and the price, etc. You can embed the ID in here, and so this can match any number of pages and render with this component, as opposed to having to create one separately for each component within our application, like Netflix, Zillow Group, Yahoo, Modus. There's some examples that show us like how to have a 404 within our application, where we match any path and then have a 404. It shows us one of the cool things that you can do when you're in React land and you're building single page applications, where you can have animated transitions. So as we are going from page to page, since the browser is not refreshing, we can actually transition from what was there before to what's there now. So there are some great examples that you can walk through as you're learning how to use React Router. There are some guides, and the quick start is what we were going through. And then there is at the bottom some detailed documentation of the library. So for instance, there is a detailed explanation of the custom hooks that come with React Router, and we're probably going to use the use history hook at some point, which gives you access to the history. Here's a simple component that goes back to the home when you click on the go to home button, and the way that it works is you get access to the history variable from using this hook, and then you can push new URLs into that history. And we can see documentation for like our browser router. Here's that component that we were using. We didn't specify any of these properties, but we can specify them. And then a description about what each of those properties does. Same for our link, for our, our route and our switch. And then there are other components that we haven't seen. So browser router is the one we're using. There's a hash router, which routes in the URL using a hashtag at the end of the URL. And there's also a memory router, which is the one that I mentioned that doesn't actually update the URL bar, but just keeps the URL in memory. So there's a lot to dig into here with the documentation, but we've got enough of a skeleton in our code to start stubbing out these pages for the play, the about, and the new form. One convention that I like to use in projects is to create my page level components in a pages folder that is separate from my components folder over here. So what I'm going to do is create a component for each of these pages. So I'm going to have a play game component, or let's call this a play page. Whoops. An about page. And a new game page. So I have an extension installed that if you want to follow along with, you can install it. It is called ES7 React Redux, etc. snippets. And what this does is give you Emmet-like hotkeys. So like IMP, and then you hit tab, gives you import module from module. Or if I scroll down here to, I think I passed it. Yeah, here we go. So if I type in RFCE, that will give me this component structure, which is the functional component that we've been creating with export default on the last line. So if I go into my play page and RFCE, hit tab, that gives me a component that matches my file name, and then it highlights the name, so puts my cursor at both places where the name is, so I can rename it to be play page, RFCE, new game page, and RFCE about page. So I've got these three components for my pages, and I can go back to my app, and instead of putting an H1 here for each of these, I can just install the appropriate component. So instead of this H1, I can say I want my play page, and about, I want my about page, and the home page, I want to be the new game page. Oops. And since I'm using the autocompletes again, all of these imports are coming for free automatically from the VS Code IntelliSense. If you don't have that working, then you can just make sure that you import all three of those from the pages folder. And the structure of our application hasn't changed. It's just that we have organized it now. So our app has less specific code in it, and the app is able to just like sort of send us off to the play page, about page, new game page, so we can separate out our styling and logic for each of those pages into these components. And again, this convention that I'm using of having a pages folder and a components folder, and making a distinction between page level components and smaller components, elements that are on the page, that's just a convention that we're going to use when we're getting started here. You'll see other conventions out in the world when you're working on applications. This isn't the only way to do it. What I want to do now is start building out our trivia game using this router. So we have a skeleton of these pages, but I want to start breaking our vanilla version of our code into components that we can then load up into our React application. So to do that, I am going to open up a new window of Visual Studio and open up the last version of our HTML that we wrote. So that was this one. And I'm going to start bringing components over bit by bit. So in the index, we had this header, and that as a unit makes sense as a component. So I'm going to create a component over here called header.js, and I am going to use RFCE to get a header, And the markup that I want to use is this markup here. And drop it in. And we're going to use that BEM kind of structure that we were using before to create a header.css and import that header.css. And then I am going to grab my styling from the quiz game here. So our header.css, I'm going to grab this, drop it in here. And I think I'm going to change some of the class names to match our BEM styling. So I'm going to say that we're going to have a class of header, and then there's the header logo and the header nav. And if I go back to my header.js, what I want to do is install those class names. So in HTML, we would write class, but since we are in React, we have to use class name, since class is a reserved word in the JavaScript language. This is going to get our header class. I can get rid of this ID and use the BEM name of header logo. And our nav can get class name of header nav. And we can go back to our app, and this that we were loading, let's get rid of this. I'm going to copy it, delete the nav from here. And these are the links that I want to end up in this header component. So since we want links that you work with our React router, we have to use the link component instead of an anchor tag. And we have to use, instead of href, the to prop. So I can, now that I've got these in, I've got homepage, play, about, I can delete the old set of anchor links, and then I need to make sure that I import link. So I could write it manually, or if I hold control space at the end of this word, it's going to pop up the autocompletes for me from VS Code, and if I click on link, it will do the importing for me. So I've got this header component. I have the BEM class names, the BEM styling imported here, and I'm using that convention that we're using where we name the component .js, and then we also have that same component name .css. So make sure I got all of this saved. I can come over to my app and drop that header component in here. And whoops, it needs to be inside of my browser router, because anything that renders a link component needs the browser router to be one of the parent components. I can get rid of this link import at the top and check out what I got. So I've got our header with the styling loading, and it's still letting us load the 3 pages that we've got set up in our application. And if I see, if I open up my DevTools, I can see that it's giving me a warning. Create React app comes configured with a linter that will check our code. A warning is just, you know, you're doing something that maybe isn't best practice or may cause an error down the line. It's not an actual error. It's not stopping our code from running or being compiled. So this is just telling us that emoji should be wrapped in a span that has the role of image for accessibility purposes and have an aria label or aria labeled by to describe what that is. So I'm going to flip back and fix that while we're at it. So I'm going to go back to my header component. And I've got a span here, but I need the role image. Make sure that I typed that right. Role img and aria label. I'm going to say this is the logo. So if I flip back, that warning should go away. This is still being rendered the same way for us in the browser, but these will have changed how this gets rendered by or read by a screen reader. So we've got our header as a component. It also makes sense to grab our footer as a component. So if I go back to index, we used this markup for the footer and this styling for the footer. So I'm going to create a new component, footer.js, and a new CSS file, footer.css, and create my footer component, grab my markup from index.html, import my footer CSS, and grab my footer CSS here, and I'm gonna change this to match more of the BEM styling where we're usually using class names to style things. So this component will be called footer, and the class name applied here will be footer. So I can flip back to my app, and now after all of these pages, I can go ahead and include the footer at the bottom and refresh. So now we've got the content loading and we've got the header above and the footer below. And one of the really, really nice things about React that is happening here is because we have broken the header and footer into separate components, when we create our individual pages, we don't have to put them on those pages. Whereas when we wrote our vanilla HTML, when we created our index.html file, we had to make sure that we copied and pasted the header that we had created here and put it at the top here, and we had to put the footer at the bottom. And if we create more pages and more links, we have to make sure that we sort of keep all of these headers and footers in sync. So if I needed to change the footer across my site and change the year from 2020 to 2021, I would have to go to every HTML file. But since we are working with components here, that I don't have to do. All I have to do if I want to change the year is go into the footer component, change this one character, and then every page now has that new year listed on it. All right, let's bring over our About page. So the About page has all of this stuff inside of the main that I want to bring over. So I'm going to copy it. I am going to get rid of this div and paste in this main. And the formatter is automatically inserting parentheses around the component here. This is to make sure that we don't end up with something like this getting inserted and formatted where the return statement appears and our JSX is below it, which means that nothing is actually being returned. This JSX is essentially ignored. And so if I look back at the browser, we're actually getting an error here that's warning us about that. So as we are working on our components, if you end up in a situation like this where the parentheses gets added, that's actually not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That helps group all of this JSX into the return and make sure that we don't end up running into issues with the automatic semicolon insertion in our formatter. So I've got the main here and my H1, H2, some paragraphs, the emoji list, the link to the cooking show, the JS output div, 2 buttons, and an image. And we're going to have to change something here about the image to make this work in our new structure. So I'm going to save this. Let's see what we got on the About page. We have the link, we have some buttons, and then our image is broken. So if I flip back, this source path, when we want an image to be included in our project, we can't use a string anymore where we just hard code and say go into the images folder and grab the thinkingface.gif. What we need to do with our images is similar to our CSS, where we actually import them. So up at the top, I am going to import my thinking GIF from up a directory into images, thinking face, and use that as the SRC. So what this looks like, actually, I'll throw it on the page so that we can see it. So when we import it, what it's giving us is the path in the built files where that GIF is going to be located. And because we import it, then the build process knows that that image needs to be bundled with our application. So part of using this import syntax is being able to register things as part of the application so they end up in the build and end up with using the right file path to get to that GIF in the build. So let's get rid of that paragraph, and we can see that the image is now loading at the bottom. And we're getting some warnings because the code used class instead of class name. So I think I'm going to do the same process that we were going through with our components, about page.css, in our JS, import about page.css, change this to be class name, and then go back to our about CSS here. And I think, oh, we had it in our general CSS. This should probably be in the about CSS and not the general CSS, but I'm going to copy this over, drop it in here into our about.css, get rid of some of these comments. Emoji are rendering again. I can see another small tweak we have to make here is that when I copied and pasted the HTML, we lost a space between the word is and the hyperlink. So if I go back to about and insert a space and save it. Oh, I guess I'm going to have to do it this way. I'm going to have to bring the hyperlink back to the previous line, hit space and save it so that our formatter is able to know that we need a space here, and it's going to insert it using the escape syntax and a string. So now we should have that space back here. And I'll go grab the styling for our click button and speak button. Drop it in here after the emoji list. So now we've got our click button and our speak button styling back in here. We're getting another warning about the emoji needing to be wrapped in a span, and a warning about how we're using our hyperlink. So we'll fix those. So let's go back and fix the emoji first. So it's telling me wrap my emoji in a span with a role of image and an aria label of thumbs up. So that should fix our problem, our one warning. And then the next warning is telling us that when we use target blank without using these other attributes, it's a security risk. There's more information in there, but basically these allow, if you don't have these, the page that gets opened has some access to the elements that are loaded on the original page and the memory loaded in the original page. So it's good practice to make sure you grab these and also drop them in anytime using target blank. So there we go. That link should still open in a new page. And our warnings are gone. One note is that when we have links on our page that aren't working with our React router, it's completely fine to use the anchor tag. So here we're actually loading a link that opens a new page, and it loads in a new tab. So it's fine for us to use the anchor tag. We don't actually want our React router to try and load this page. We want it to act as a normal hyperlink. So I'm going to skip bringing over the logic for our click button and speak button in this video, but you should have all of the knowledge now to be able to do that yourself. It is just a matter of creating the logic up here for on speak click and on click button click, however you want to name those functions, and then registering them down here in the on click handler. You'll have to change a little bit of the logic. Like let's go back here, and we got about open. This button is using the style property to change an element. But remember, we saw how to change the background color and color by passing in the style as a property to the button. So you don't have to use this kind of logic. Instead, you're going to calculate the hue and use that with a style object like we did in our rainbow click, where we created the style and passed it into, what did we pass it into here? We passed it into a paragraph. So you could do the same thing, but pass it into the button to make the button's hue change. So I'm going to leave that as it is. Let's go into the new game page, and I want to have this page load our new game form instead of this div. Whoops, new game form. And the autocomplete is not popping up. Let me make sure. Yes, I called it new game form. So I'm just going to write this by hand. Up at the top, import up a directory into components, new game form, and whoops, call this new game form this path. Save it, check it out in the browser. So we should have our about, and we should have our homepage that has our form where I can put in my name, number of questions, pick a category, hit play. And this will be where we end our integration of React Router for the moment. So we haven't filled out our play page just yet, but what we learned how to do was bring in external dependencies to our project, including React Router, and learned how to set up this page structure. So we have the skeleton for our application now. And just to quickly review what we wrote, so we now have some components in our page folder, and this is just a convention. This isn't something that needs to be there for all React applications, but the way that I use the pages folder is these are the wrappers for the different components that live at the page level, and then I have some smaller components that get loaded into pages, like the rainbow button, welcome message, new game form, header, footer, etc. Go in the components folder. And we've done all of this routing inside of our app, which is the thing that we render to the page from index.js. So we're putting that into the root element. And we have a browser router that wraps our whole application. Inside of that is a switch, and we can define some routes, some paths in our application. And as a child, we can pass in the component that should be rendered when that route runs or when that route is matched. So when we go to /play, this will be what's loaded. When we go to /about, this will be what's loaded. And the switch enforces that only one of these is allowed to be shown at a time. And we started to see how to break some components like our header and footer from our index.html into these separate components in our React application. So like here's our header that had a nav, and we were able to import our styling in a kind of BEM format, BEM naming convention to match our new structure. So that's it for now. Next time we'll dive into making this play page and having our trivia load on the page.